Hello, everyone, and welcome to, I suppose, the only lunchtime edition of Bristol, Britain and Beyond, the festival of talks with journalists and media experts brought to you by Epigram, Bristol University's award-winning student newspaper. Joining us today, very, very kindly, and thank you for being here, is Michael Jermey. Michael is ITV's Director of News and Current Affairs, making him quite literally the boss of some of the world's leading journalists, including Robert Peston, Emily Morgan and Reggie Omar. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to see you, Teddy, and great to be here with so many people who work on a newspaper that I know has got a great reputation.
Exactly. Thank you very much. And I believe you worked on your own student newspaper. So.
I did more years ago than I can remember, but for more than 35 years ago. But I'm still in touch with one or two of the people that I worked with on student journalism. So I think the bonds that you might well form with people on Epigram, they can last a very long time.
Right, that's great to hear. And yeah, that's sort of a bit of relatability, I suppose, with Michael. I suppose I'd just like to get into your role a bit first, just for those sort of clarify it for those who've just joined. So what does ITV's Director of News sort of entail? And what might an ordinary or average day look like for you?
So ITV makes an awful lot of news and current affairs programmes, both nationally, programmes that everybody will be familiar with, like News at 10 or the Evening News with Mary Nightingale. We make national current affairs, Robert Peston's programme on Wednesday nights covering political current affairs, the investigative strand Exposure, the programme that first broke the scandal around Jimmy Savile. Then in addition to that, we have one-off series and also Britain's most watched current affairs programme, weekly current affairs programme in The Tonight Show, presented by Julie Etchingham. And then in addition to national television content, we have 18 separate regional services across the country. Digital services, obviously, as well. During lockdown, we've been doing more podcasts than we used to do, responding to the interest people have in that. So a pretty extensive service. We probably invest more in first-hand journalism than any other organisation other than the BBC. We reach more people than any other organisation than the BBC. We are, in a sense, the leading commercial news provider in the UK.
Yeah, it sounds like you have quite a bit on, and you're sort of at the helm of that. I want to dive straight into, I suppose, sort of what it's been like to cover the pandemic, because that's been a particularly novel situation. Covering all of that at the best of times is tricky. But I'd like to go back to the start, if you don't mind, sort of when the pandemic first struck and restrictions were first being introduced. Was there any question as to whether you would be able to keep the news rolling, keep things going? And what were some of the challenges you faced?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, Teddy. And it's quite hard for all of us, isn't it, to think back a year and try to remember quite what we did and didn't know at that time. But as we toppled towards lockdown, we were absolutely determined to keep all our news services on air. We felt we had a vital public service role to keep our news services on air. But to be frank, we didn't necessarily know how we would do it. We didn't know how contagious the disease would be. We didn't know how tight the restrictions would be. We very early on had conversations with government about the role that our journalists played. Government wanted them to be designated as key workers. And that designation of key worker actually has probably been less relevant than it might have been at one point. I think within government, they were contemplating not letting anybody who didn't have that designation more or less go out at all. And therefore, without that, you wouldn't have been able to cover the news. We were determined to stay on air. We worked out how we could do that. We contemplated broadcasting from home. We contemplated a world in which nobody would be in the office at all. We settled in the end for a hybrid model where our newsrooms that are normally full on any given day with scores of people probably had at maximum 20% of normal occupancy. Everybody else working from home on technology like this. Reporters and crews would go out on stories. They wouldn't travel together. They would travel separately. They would stay more than 2 meters apart. Viewers very quickly started to see in those sort of comic long microphone poles. The first time you saw one, you probably laughed. The 50th time you saw one, it almost had become part of normal life. And the way we make television news programs is fundamentally different from the way we made them a bit over a year ago. And I think obviously the audience was very accepting of that for a couple of reasons. One, there was a real desire for news. People tuned in big numbers. And if the service looked a bit rough around the edges, people were prepared to accept that. But of course, everybody was also leading a life a bit like that. So it's not odd seeing an interview over Skype or over Zoom when people themselves are spending large parts of their own time either working like that or talking to friends and relatives through that sort of technology.
Yeah, definitely. There's sorts of things we got used to. Remember that, with the polls and the interviews at the front door of the house and sort of standing at the front of the gun. I'd like to talk, there must have been a sort of sense of duty at one stage. You talked there about the idea of you journalists becoming key workers. Did you feel that you as a broadcast institution, as a news provider, had a real duty to provide something in this sort of unprecedented
Yes,
time?
and listen, I don't want to overstate the case. We're not working in ICU units. We're not nurses on the front line risking our lives to keep people alive. But yes, I do think that public service broadcasting is important in the best of times. I think accurate, impartial news is important to our democracy. But I think it was especially important during the period of COVID, and perhaps especially important during the early months, when people were locked down in their homes, not necessarily able to even see what was happening 5 miles from where they live. I think it was important that we were able to do several things and convey vital public health information, which could be, through social media and so forth, could be presented in a confused way. We felt we had a responsibility to provide clear and accurate information at a time when the government, for good reasons, was taking away sort of fundamental civil liberties. It was important that we played a role in preserving democracy and question government, question those in authority about what they were doing, and to use the phrase, held them to account. And then there was something else about television news, which I wouldn't have predicted, but I began to feel as people wrote to us about the presence of our programs on air. And yes, it was partly about the information. Yes, it was partly about questioning people in authority, but actually the mere presence of familiar programs, lots of people said they found that really reassuring at a time when their world was being turned upside down. To see their national news and particularly their local news still there on air made them feel the world wasn't quite as strange as perhaps they thought it was going to be. And that sense of stability and reassuring familiarity, if you'd asked me last January, I'm not sure I would have immediately predicted that, but it was very interesting as people started to tell us that through April and May.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose that's sort of anecdotal, but those are letters that you're receiving from the public. We've also heard the sort of trust in media has gone up as a result of the pandemic. Do you think in a way, perhaps broadcast specifically has had a good pandemic? For want of a better word?
Yes, I do. I think the trust statistics, I think you have to really look closely at them. They're quite interesting. If you look at, there's a really big international survey called the Edelman Trust Barometer that looks at trust at levels in business, government, media, social media. And actually over the last 12 months, in most of the 20 plus countries they survey, trust has gone down in government, business and media, and particularly down in social media. But then if you bear into those numbers and you look at some of the UK data, and Ofcom did a big survey last summer, the public service broadcasters have much higher levels of trust than other institutions. And what's the reason for that? I think the reason for that is people recognise that public service broadcasting tries to do things accurately. I think it's recognised that when we make mistakes, we're more ready than lots of institutions to put our hands up, that we can provide a forum in which different political shades of opinion can debate and argue. And I think that public service broadcasting is a really important thing for the UK to preserve. You can see in the United States what happens when your media becomes polarized, and when common ground where a commonly accepted set of facts can be debated from both sides begins to disappear. And I think a lot of the division in America is as a result of people listening to a completely different set of media at times with completely different view of what the basic facts are, and the two sides not debating with each other. I think we're lucky in the UK to have an ecology where you have a number of public service broadcasters in competition with each other. They keep each other honest. I think there is a greater commonality of accepted fact in the UK than there is in the United States. And I think there are more forums in which you get genuine political debate right across the political spectrum. And I think those things combined help to support a healthy democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And maintaining that throughout the pandemic as well. How did you make sure to get that tone right in covering the pandemic? And you mentioned sort of, you know, as you said, for want of a better phrase, holding the government to account. At the same time, you were trying to convey key public messages.
Yeah.
So how did you strike that balance?
And I think there's potential conflict between those two things. I think, you know, you're at a press conference where the government is telling you something that is true about social distancing or about you know, the need to do certain things for the virus not to spread, at the same time as your journalist is probing to see whether they're telling the truth on how well they're doing on the distribution of PPE or what have you. And I think it is a balance to get right, and one that we practiced early on, and I think, you know, we revised some of the things as we went along. But, you know, I think actually there isn't ultimately a conflict between those two things. I think if you have trusted journalists saying X, Y, and Z, you know, does help to reduce the spread of the virus, and here's the evidence for that, and here's the public health official and the scientist, and sometimes the scientists and the doctors are much better at putting that message across than the politicians. And in the same programme, I'm going to give the minister a hard time because actually the promises they made on delivering PPE to the front line aren't being met, and we have a reporter on the front line able to show that's not the case. I think as a viewer, you think, okay, these people are not saps to the government's line. They're people who are happy to hold authority to account, to challenge it, to provide evidence. And yet at the same time, they're also able to root their public health information in scientific fact and to explore that properly. And if you're, as we are, broadcasting to an intelligent public who are discerning and can, you know, sniff out propaganda and nonsense, actually having both those things in the same program, I think, you know, creates a healthy environment. And I think our journalists on ITV at least did challenge politicians around almost all the central issues and all the central things that went wrong in those early months. At the same time, as I think we communicated really clearly to our viewers the essential public health messages. And, you know, not saying for a moment we did all that perfectly, but I think we did have a good pandemic, and really happy for our work to be looked back on at the end of it all.
Yeah, and in the book that the ITV have put together, you know, of the voices of your journalists, I suppose, in the first 6 months of the pandemic, reporting coronavirus. I think, see if I should just put a link up for people. The number of your journalists, of course, describe the sort of emotional toll and the difficulty in covering a story that was actually also affecting their personal life. You know, Rob Peston describes it affecting his family. Raggy Omar talks about when his cousin was in the same hospital ward as Boris Johnson. And of course, Emily Morgan went to the front line in Bournemouth. What was kind of the emotional toll on some of your journalists, and how did they deal with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, there has never been a story like this, not just in my time in television, but since television news was invented in the mid-50s. And the reason I say that is not because there hasn't been, you know, other really big stories, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism in Eastern Europe, the Arab Spring, you know, also, you know, 9/11, all sorts of major television news stories, but there hasn't been one that's affected every continent in the world, affected every street in Britain and every family in Britain, and changed the way people actually have to make television news. So, you know, the lives of journalists were exactly the same as lives of everybody else in Britain, and the whole range of experiences, from some people being unaffected to some people losing relatives to the disease. And the only real difference, and it's a significant one, is whereas most citizens were, you know, being asked to work from home if they could, not necessarily getting out very much, journalists were going to the front line and seeing what was happening. But I don't, as I said earlier, I don't want to sort of exaggerate or suggest any sort of enormous heroism around that. there are plenty of people who've, as a result of their, the nature of their work, have had more stress and more suffering than journalists have. But as you say, there are people who were reading the news when they had relatives who were in intensive care. I have a colleague who lost both his mother and his sister during the pandemic, as he was also making documentaries about it. But that's the experience of millions and millions of Britons. And in a sense, this was a story where the people working on it absolutely were having the same experiences as the viewers watching it. The difference was, as I say, they on occasions had greater access to what was happening, and their job by its very nature meant they had to think about the issues an awful lot. But essentially, the experience of journalists working on the pandemic, for good, bad, or awful, was the same spectrum of experiences as every person living in the UK.
Yeah, and I suggest those who get the book definitely to turn to Emily Morgan when she just sort of described going to the front line, and actually it's not about her, it's about respecting the stories of those on the ICU and those being called up early. Yeah, for sure. And it makes you think again about when you see it broadcast live. We've moved away a bit from coronavirus before, but just to do so fully, the last 5 years or so, I think it's fair to say, have been sort of beset by political instability globally. Has that actually, in a way, created quite an interesting landscape for journalism? Has it been quite an interesting 5 years or so for journalism?
Yeah, well, it's never dull. You can certainly say that. If you look at politics, we covered a referendum in 2014, a general election in 2015, another referendum in 2016, a general election in 2017. We put our feet up in 2018 and had another general election in 2019. So, there's been an awful lot of politics. The election of Donald Trump threw up hundreds of events and news days that probably none of us would have imagined earlier in our professional lives. The Brexit referendum and everything that flowed from that, fundamentally changed our news agenda. So it's been a deeply interesting and lively time to work in television news and in journalism generally. But I think it almost always is. I remember a brief time in the early 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and before the war in the former Yugoslavia had really taken off, when a few people said, oh, there's not going to be much news around. There was the whole academic stuff about the end of history. Some news programs in the States started doing, news you can use that was very consumer centric and so forth. That era didn't last very long. The Yugoslav war came along. 9/11 came along, the struggles in the Middle East started to dominate news. And I think if you look back over any 20-year period since television news started in the 1950s, you will find an awful lot of stories. So for anybody who's going into journalism, they shouldn't worry that they're going to be entering it after the interesting stuff has happened. There's always interesting stuff to come along. And that's one of the things that makes journalism such a rewarding trade to be in. If you want to make a fortune, don't go into journalism. But if you want to have a really interesting professional life, watching the world change and watching how big forces affect individual people's lives, and if you have a fascination in people and a fascination in trying to work out how the world's changing and how the world works, and you'll know that if you have that fascination, then stick to what you want to do. And if journalism is what you want to do, it's a great way to spend your life.
Great, very encouraging. We'll come on to more of that in a sec. Just got a question here from Siavash, sticking with the news and media landscape. He says, we've heard about GB News, which is a new Fox-like network that is looking to be set up in the UK. He asks, is that dangerous for public discourse, or do you think conversely?
Yeah, I'm not going. There's been a bit of a bandwagon of people condemning GB News. I think it's really unfair to condemn anything that's never put a program on the air. Why don't we all wait and see what it's like? It's going to be regulated by Ofcom. Ofcom requires impartiality. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean what I think it once meant, which was a very even-handed presentation of the news. I think it probably does allow for more opinionated commentary than it once did, but it nevertheless requires some balancing views in there. So I'm not sure that you're likely to see in the UK the more extreme versions that in the States you sometimes see of only one political view being put. But as I say, listen, let's give everybody a chance to put their programmes on the air before we start jumping in and criticising them.
Yeah, interesting. But I suppose to what you know and sticking with ITV, how have you remained sort of innovative? You talked earlier about podcasts and things like that. How have you tried to stay ahead of the game sort of for so long, as opposed to sort of responding or reacting to the things?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, because it's always easier to innovate as a small startup or on the edges of the media. And we are, an absolutely mainstream media institution. Our television audience is, older than the average population. We've been around for forever, and some of our audience, I would say, is small c conservative, doesn't want too much change. So the balance often for us is to not be so far ahead of the curve that people no longer think of you as the main place they want to go for their news, or one of the main places they go for their news. But equally not want to end up in a position where people say, oh, I used to like it, but it hasn't changed and it feels so old-fashioned. So I think what we essentially try to do is to innovate and be ahead of the BBC in new things that we adopt. And I've heard it said from colleagues in the BBC, once upon a time, one director of BBC News famously said, we watch what ITV News does, and if it works 5 years later, we adopt it. We hope to be slightly more ahead of the curve than that, but we don't want to be gimmicky. We don't want to just go with fashion. So in our television news, we look to take bright ideas from wherever they come and adapt over time. I think in digital, it gives us a chance, like so many other people, a chance to do much more than that. So for instance, 18 months ago, we launched a bulletin on Snapchat and Instagram called The Rundown, that is directed at 14 to 17-year-olds trying to sort of appeal to a teenage market, that has the same fundamental underlying values of accurate news and impartiality, but looks absolutely nothing like News at 10. It's presented by young journalists, it has a very snappy style, a very colloquial way of speaking to its audience. It's released at 3:45 in the afternoon when secondary schools are checking out, or they are in non-pandemic times. And it was viewed 140 million times last year and went out 365 days a year. So that's an example of innovation. We've put our toe in the true crime podcast market. A very compelling series based down in your part of the world, in the awful murder of Melanie Road, and the cold case investigation produced by the team that's the ITV News team in Bristol, catching Melanie's killer. That's not completely innovative. Other people are doing true crime podcasts, but we try to appeal to a wide range of audience. So you can be a 14-year-old tuning into The Rundown. You can be 65 and watching your comfortable regional news, and all points in between. I think there are some common strands running through ITV News journalism, that we seek to be accessible, we seek to be a sort of peer-to-peer broadcaster. We don't think we've got tablets of stone that we want to pass down from the mount. We want to be impartial, we want to be accurate, but within that there can be quite a range of styles that appeal to different segments of the audience.
Yeah, the sort of key strands and fundamentals of journalism, but to some extent, has the role of a journalist throughout your time in journalism shifted? Should a journalist now look to be going into podcasts as well, be able to do that, be able to be, I suppose, a mobile journalist, as well as the sort of key principles?
Yeah, I think some fundamentals in journalism don't change. a desire to find out what's going on, a desire to find out especially things that people in power don't want you to know, to present that in a way that audience will find accessible and interesting and engaging. Those things don't change, and actually those things are the things that matter most. But the way you do that changes immensely over the decades. When I first started in TV journalism, there were 4 television channels in the UK only. You had to wait, pretty much you had to wait for your news for the times that broadcasters decided to put it on. You could have swathes of the day when you couldn't really hear news. Then we had the advent of news channels in a big way, CNN taking off at the time of the first Gulf War, as a really big phenomenon. Sky News launching in 1989. You saw more news channels coming out over the time. You saw the launch of All News Radio. Then you saw the setting up in the late 90s of websites. They became a more dominant form of news than they've been. I had the interesting experience of working and putting the first video news bulletin on a mobile phone with the Hutchison 3 network in around 2000. And we now can never escape the news, where you've got a phone in your pocket and it jumps out at you, whether you want it or not. So all those things have changed. All of that change is good. All of it means that your generation of journalists have more opportunities to do different forms of broadcasting. Once upon a time, there were gatekeepers, and it was really hard to get your story out there unless you could get through one of those gates. There were still gatekeepers, but actually anybody in their 20s who's got a story can put it out through social media, can create a podcast, can write a blog, and all of that has done a lot to democratize the world of news. That's not to say that the big players that can pull in large audiences don't still have a very significant impact, nor that it's not a very satisfying place to work for one of the big media outlets. But it's not the only way. And all of you as journalists, sort of old dinosaurs like me, came in and we learned our bit of making television news, and technicians told us we couldn't touch a camera, couldn't even touch a tape back in the day. The generation that you're part of will shoot video, be able to use all forms of digital media, will learn how to make television packages, will learn how to write stories, a full range of skills. And the more of those skills you can adopt and learn to do really well, the more employable you'll be to any organisation, whether they're principally print media, principally audio, or principally video. And more, all those organisations are seeing themselves as all those things rather than just one of those things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose you've answered parts of that there. Question from Elizabeth says, what would you suggest is the best way to become a TV news broadcaster? Would you recommend a master's in journalism? Or I suppose would you do some of the other things that you mentioned about a blog or the like?
Yeah, I'll give an answer to that, but I'll caveat it with there are almost as many routes into journalism as there are journalists. I do think the master's courses are good, that if you get taken onto one of the good ones, you will learn a lot. And you will also, crucially, as you go looking for jobs, you will be noticed by employers who do rate them. So, there are a good number of them, but the City course, the Cardiff course, and some others are highly rated in the industry. And people coming out of those do get jobs. And part of that is the skills they've been equipped with, because there is good teaching on some of those courses. And part of it is in a world where every company is getting hundreds of applications, they slightly stand out. But that isn't to say that's the only route in. People take other routes, people have false starts, people try one organisation, then another, people set up on their own and then leverage that into getting jobs in the media. So there isn't just one route. But if behind that question is it worth doing one of the masters if you can get the money to pay for the course? Yes, it is. Is the level of debt you end up leaving those with something which over the long term, if you're committed to a job in broadcast medium, media, is a sensible debt to have taken on. I think it probably is. With educational debt that yours does. I deeply regret that yours does. I do think that if you take a really long-term view, that the debt you've got for having gone to a good university like you all do and going and doing a good master's in something like journalism is one that, given that you're going to have 30, 40-year careers ahead of you, and given that most of the debt is debt you don't have to pay back if you haven't got a job or if you take a long career break, the perspective that I suspect you'll have on it 10 years, 15 years out is different from the one you've got today. And I think for the good courses, it's worth making that commitment if you're in a position to do so.
Yeah, and you talk about commitment, and you've been a journalist yourself, worked with countless of journalists at the top of their game. What I suppose are the skills or attributes that I suppose you're really looking for and that kind of allows them to be so committed for so long?
Yeah, I think most people on this call will know if they want to do it. If you are really inquisitive about the world, if you can't really imagine doing anything else, if you want to go into a profession that is less well paid than quite a lot of things that you all probably could do, that is less predictable, but is exciting, allows you to, that puts your inquisitiveness as a strong virtue as opposed to something an organization doesn't want you to do, which lots of corporate world would probably meet, that you like doing creative things, you like either writing or creating video or creating audio, that you don't see it as an imposition, having to listen to the news in the morning through the day, that you want to read newspapers, read magazines, listen to the radio, watch television, that all of that feels something. You can't imagine a day where you didn't do a lot of that. If all those things ring a bell and you say, yeah, I really want to do that, I can't imagine a satisfying professional life without doing that, then you're on the right course. You want to be a journalist. If you think, oh, that sounds really rather like hard work, I want to work 9 to 5, I don't want my professional interest to be all absorbing or nearly all absorbing, then it might be the wrong route. I think most journalists know it's the only thing they really want to do. And if that's you, then it's a fantastically rewarding life. There is the odd person you come across in journalism who you wonder why is there, because they don't have that passion, they don't have that inquisitiveness, and they probably took the wrong route. But given that there are quite a lot of hurdles put in the way of stopping you to become a journalist, it's quite difficult to become a journalist. It's quite easy to do the milk round and go to all sorts of corporate organisations. It's quite difficult to do a master's or get that first step in the door or go and freelance. Especially when the immediate rewards and probably the long-term rewards, financial ones, are lower. So you're not going to go through all those hurdles unless you know you want to do it. What I would say is don't be put off by those hurdles if you really want to do it. It's worth it. It's worth the effort of jumping through that. It provides a really interesting professional life. You meet loads of interesting people. That's not only the people you work with, but the stories that you get to cover. And I've come across people in all sorts of walks of life who've had regrets about the professions they went into. I can't think of many journalists I know who've done it for 20 plus years who have any regrets at all. Some people move into other careers at some point, but they normally have very fond memories of their time in journalism, and then they use the skills they've learned in journalism to do other things which are, equally interesting or interesting in different ways. So you will know yourself, I think, whether it's right for you, and if it is right for you, go for it, because it's it can be a really satisfying time, and probably the most difficult career step is that first one of getting into an organisation, beginning your career. after that, it can take multiple different courses, but it becomes easier on the whole to make those moves than I think that very first step feels like at the time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really, really interesting and kind of encouraging there for everyone listening who wants to go into journalism. Got two good questions to finish it with from the audience. First is from Georgie. I suppose, as you're saying, this is for anyone who wants to be a foreign correspondent, but to you in particular, is it tough being responsible for journalists' safety? And I suppose, that could link to the Capitol riots. And also, if you're a journalist and you want to be a foreign correspondent, you have to be responsible for your own safety. Is that a tough thing to reckon with?
Yes, it is. Of the things, I don't normally lose sleep over anything. It's one of the areas in my career that, yes, I have lost sleep over. I remember making the phone call to the partner of a colleague who'd been shot and very seriously injured in the former Yugoslavia. He was in a Yugoslav army operating theatre at the time. I flew out to Belgrade with his partner. Thankfully, after blood transfusion, I think 14 pints of blood and a long and slow road to recovery, he lived. But I've also had friends who have died in those situations, and everybody in the industry needs to take it very, very seriously. When I first was involved in international news, there wasn't much sort of conscious thinking by the industry about safety. I remember, when we first started introducing forms of body armour and courses that people can go on dealing with conflict zones and armoured vehicles. And this was really, I think, in the early 1990s, back in the 70s and 80s. Some of it before my time at all in television and some of it in my early days in television. People didn't think about those issues very much. I think there was a slightly different culture around safety generally, but also journalists were less targets than they became. I think as soon as international satellite news services started to beam their signals into the areas where the conflict was, journalists became to be seen by some of the combatants as players in the conflict rather than just neutral observers, and so they became targets, and it became more dangerous. So yes, it is a preoccupation of anybody who works in television news, either as an executive or news editor, asking people to go to conflict areas, or as a foreign correspondent or producer or camera operator or technician operating there. I think the industry has become much better at thinking these issues through, of preparing people for it, of protecting them from it. But the nature of, especially international news gathering, will always be the case that on a certain sort of story, there will always be significant and considerable risks. And people shouldn't go into that lightly. Organisations shouldn't put inexperienced people into those positions. They should give them the required training, put experienced people with less experienced people. And I think the big broadcasters in the last 20 years have done a good job on that. For a while, a few years ago, I was chair of a charity called the Rory Peck Trust. And the Rory Peck Trust provides support to freelancers operating in difficult war zones. And it's named after a very fine camera operator, Rory Peck, who died in the former Soviet Union, covering conflict there in the early 1990s. And back in those days, I think freelancers especially got very little support. Situation is better than it was. Broadcasters, the big newspaper groups and so forth, look after, if you like, their own freelancers and have a sense of responsibility for them. But there are still freelancers who are operating completely on their own without the support of an employer, which is why a charity like the Rory Peck Trust needs to exist. And then, of course, there are many thousands of people around the world in countries where there is conflict who work as freelancers in their own country, and the standards of support often are quite low or non-existent. And I think the industry as a whole, and the Rory Peck Trust is part of that, needs to provide international solidarity around it. What I would say to any young journalist who sort of, is tempted to head off to a war zone and make their name, to think long and hard about it, take advice from people who know a lot about it, if possible. If you really are committed to doing that, do that with more experienced people. Go on one of the courses that equips you a little bit better for dealing with that for the first time, and you can get grants and bursaries. The Rory Peck Trust and one or two other people, the International News Safety Institute, can provide advice around that. But I certainly wouldn't encourage anyone to do that. But if somebody is absolutely determined to do it, they can make themselves better prepared than they otherwise would be. I guess I also think that it's possible to become a foreign correspondent a little later in your career, after you've got a ground in domestic journalism and perhaps have got a job with one of the bigger organisations. And I think a lot of people have probably found that a safer way of doing it than thinking you really want to do it on your own.
Thank you very much. And interesting for those who want to go into it. And then, just as your question did, sort of coming close to shores, we got a question from Saksha, who says, how effective do you think the Downing Street press briefings are? I know Robert Peston described them as a little bit weird and surreal. Do you think they're a good way of holding government to account?
Not particularly. I mean, I think they're a good way for the government to get out its clear messages in an effective, in quite an effective way to all media. There is the opportunity for critical questions, at least from the big media players. I think it's worth noting that it's a fairly limited number of organisations that routinely get invited to that. BBC, ITV, Sky, some of the big newspapers, but there are plenty of people who aren't. But I equally think you can rest too much on it. That's not the only journalism that's going on. If that was the only journalism going on, I'd be shocked and horrified. But any journalist can pick up the phone or email one of the thousands of people who have knowledge of what's going on during the pandemic. The government should not be the only source for information. It's sort of lazy journalism if you look at the 5 o'clock briefing as a place you'll get the full set of information you need. It's the government's view and the government putting their position across with an opportunity for a small number of probing questions. So I have no objection to them, but let's not make them too big a part of the journalism that goes on. Most days I don't find time to tune in, and they're not so compelling that they're always worth an hour. I'm reading a quick summary of them and plenty of other journalistic sources on the story is, to my mind, a better use of limited time.
Yeah, we heard, I think, from Laura Kunsberg, she was caught off Zoom saying that, Boris Johnson, frustration that he didn't answer the question. But I suppose, are you always trying to break beyond that sort of press release, that sort of wall put up by government that is put out? Is that what?
Yeah, I mean, press releases are sometimes a useful starting point. They're certainly useful to know what officialdom would like you to think. But good journalism is about asking questions behind every line of a press release, but also going and asking questions on subjects that aren't mentioned in press releases. The government would not have chosen to have the PPE story covered at all if it could have avoided it. It was good journalists going and asking questions. The care home deaths would not have been covered if good journalists, including Paul Brand from ITV, who I think did a fantastic job, didn't travel the country talking to care homes, finding out what was going on in them. Government has a job to do, and it is very different from the job that we have to do. There's a coincidence of interest sometimes, but sometimes there's a conflict of interest, and everybody should be happy and comfortable and just see that as part of living in a vibrant democracy.
Yeah. Final question, just while we can, I suppose. What's that thrill like for you? Is it the same as it was when you were a journalist yourself, when you get that sort of exclusive, or you're uncovering, the crisis in care homes as an example?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'd put that in that category. That was such a sad and appalling story. I'm glad that we did it. It was a piece of responsible broadcasting. But sort of more generally, yes, if you get an exclusive story on that you've got something that everybody else would like to have and nobody has, that is an exciting moment in truth. You know, sometimes actually when you talk about the excitement in a newsroom, I think you've got to be slightly careful, because I think non-journalists don't always understand that. It can feel ludicrously competitive, or it can feel, you know, wrong to be excited about a big breaking news story on which you do well. But I think all professions have a bit of that. You know, I'm sure surgeons are pleased when they have a particularly complicated piece of surgery which they pull off successfully. It doesn't mean that their primary aim isn't, you know, the responsible recovery of the patient, but I think most professions have some element of you know, professional satisfaction from doing things well. And journalism is definitely that. And a big breaking news story that is covered well by a newsroom is an exciting moment. And I feel that as much today as I did on the first day I was in journalism. It's a privilege to work in a television newsroom. It's a privilege to work in any big newsroom. If you enjoy it, I know a lot of people who've continued to enjoy it for decades. If it's not your thing, then every day could be a challenge. But in your heart of hearts, you will either know that now as you contemplate going into it. You'll certainly know it within a year or so of working in the industry. And I enjoy it as much today as I did in my 20s, and have absolutely no regrets about the career choices I made.
It's a lovely way to end it. We're admittedly 2 minutes over. I'm sure as director of ITV News, you're very busy.
Well, thank you, Teddy, and let me wish everybody the very best. You're doing your studies in quite challenging times. I'm really impressed by what your entire generation is doing, and I wish you all the very best of luck as you step into the jobs market and start media careers in the next year or so.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we appreciate that from everyone here. Yeah, it has been certainly a challenge. We're all in sort of disparate parts of